Here's the rewritten version in one clean paragraph, keeping the key points while making the language more natural and engaging. In October 2024, the Indiana Fever president made a brief comment that barely caught anyone's attention at the time. But 9 months later, that single remark suddenly went viral and sent shockwaves through Caitlin Clark's fan base. She compared the Fever to an apple, and once you understand why that comparison hit such a nerve, you may never look at the situation the same way again. What made it even more interesting was that the president's social media account disappeared just hours after the old video resurfaced. There was no statement, no explanation, and no public response, just silence, which suggested that someone inside the organization realized how damaging the situation looked. To understand why the Apple comment mattered so much, you have to look at what the Indiana Fever were like before Caitlin Clark arrived. For years, the team struggled to attract attention and success. They won just 6 games in 2021, 5 in 2022, and 13 in 2023. This was not a short rebuilding period. The Fever had spent nearly a decade near the bottom of the league in relevance. Home crowds were often small, national television appearances were rare, and there was very little excitement surrounding the team. In some games, only 4,000 or 5,000 fans showed up inside an arena that could hold around 17,000 people, leaving entire sections of empty blue seats. The atmosphere was so quiet that it sometimes felt like the players were performing mainly for family, longtime supporters, and a small group of loyal fans who had followed the franchise since the Tamika Catchings era. But the Fever were never supposed to become an irrelevant franchise. They had a real history and had once been a serious team. In 2009, Indiana even reached the WNBA finals, proving that the organization had once been capable of competing at the highest level. In 2012, the Indiana Fever reached another major milestone by winning the championship, with League Commissioner Kathy Engelbert congratulating the team as Tamika Catchings lifted the trophy in front of a packed Bankers Life Fieldhouse. 3 years later, the Fever returned to the WNBA Finals, showing that they were still one of the league's strongest organizations. But after Catchings retired in 2016, the franchise began a steep decline. Coaching changes, front office turnover, 8 straight losing seasons, and repeated playoff misses slowly turned a once successful team into one that many fans barely noticed. By 2023, the Fever had the worst record in the WNBA, and many casual basketball fans could not name a single player on the roster. Top free agents had little reason to choose Indiana, the on-court product struggled, and the team's marketing failed to create much attention. Then everything changed in April 2024. The Fever held the #1 pick in the WNBA draft and selected Caitlin Clark, a player who was far more than a talented prospect. She was a national sensation and one of the most watched college basketball players in years, male or female. Her Elite Eight rematch between Iowa and LSU attracted around 12.3 million viewers, surpassing several major sporting events. When Clark arrived in Indianapolis, the impact was immediate. Her first preseason game in Dallas drew roughly 13,000 fans, and her regular season home opener sold out within hours. Suddenly, every road game became a major attraction, with opponents setting attendance records and even moving games into larger arenas to handle the demand. Washington moved its Fever matchup to the Wizards Arena, while cities such as Connecticut, Las Vegas, and Phoenix saw huge crowds. Television ratings reached levels the WNBA had never experienced before, with some games attracting more than 2 million viewers, and the league struggled to keep up with demand for Caitlin Clark jerseys. The Fever were selling out so fast that even platforms that had never shown WNBA highlights before were suddenly sharing Caitlin Clark's viral 30-foot step-back threes. For perhaps the first time, the Indiana Fever became one of the most talked about teams in women's basketball. And this is the key point. It wasn't because of the organization, the coaching staff, or some massive marketing campaign. It was one player, Caitlin Clark. That fact becomes extremely important as the story moves forward. Things took another major turn when the Fever made a big move at the top of the organization after realizing just how valuable they had become. Caitlin Clark had helped transform the franchise from an overlooked team into one of the biggest attractions in women's sports. In October 2024, Kelly Krauskopf returned as the Fever's president of basketball and business operations. On paper, the decision made perfect sense. Krauskopf wasn't a stranger to Indiana. She had previously worked with the Fever and played an important role in building the 2012 championship team. She understood basketball, knew the Indiana organization, and had strong ties to the franchise. When she was introduced at the press conference, the atmosphere was positive and full of excitement. The team believed they had someone who understood the game and could help build a long-term contender around Caitlin Clark. Krauskopf then stepped up to the microphone and explained that the Fever wanted to build around Clark and Aaliyah Boston as their core players. That sounded logical, positive, and exactly what fans wanted to hear. But then she made another comment that would eventually create a major reaction from the Fever fan base. She said she wanted the Indiana Fever to grow into a national. At the time, nobody paid much attention when Krauskopf said she wanted the Fever to become a national leader and build a lasting brand like Apple. It sounded like a normal statement from a new president talking about setting big goals and growing the franchise. The press conference ended, reporters moved on, and the video was eventually buried online. For about 9 months, almost nobody talked about it. Then, in July 2025, everything changed. Caitlin Clark had been dealing with a groin injury for weeks, and the Fever were struggling to maintain momentum as they fought for a playoff spot. Clark had played in only 11 games, while frustrated fans were watching ticket resale prices fall and TV ratings drop. Then someone went back through old footage, found Krauskopf's Apple comment, and reposted the video. Within hours, it exploded across the internet. But the reaction was not what Krauskopf likely expected. Fans began looking at the Apple comparison in a completely different way. Apple is not just a successful company. It is also one of the clearest examples of what can happen when a company loses the visionary figure who helped define it. When Steve Jobs left Apple in the 1980s, the company struggled badly and came close to collapse before his eventual return. So when Caitlin Clark's supporters heard the Fever being compared to Apple, they didn't hear an ambitious plan to build a powerful brand. They heard something much more concerning. The front office appeared to be treating Caitlin Clark as just one piece of the Fever's business, rather than recognizing that she was the main reason the franchise had reached this level of attention in the first place. Social media quickly filled with angry fans, and the comment sections exploded. One fan pointed out that Apple became a global powerhouse because of Steve Jobs' vision and star power, while another predicted that if Clark eventually became frustrated with the Fever's front office, the organization might look back and realize it had wasted the biggest opportunity in women's sports history. The backlash wasn't random or limited to a few angry posts. It was widespread, loud, and impossible to ignore. Then the situation became even more interesting. Just hours after the Apple video went viral, Kelly Krauskopf's entire social media profile suddenly disappeared. There was no announcement, no explanation, and no apology. An account that had been active only days earlier was simply gone. That move immediately raised more questions and made fans wonder whether the front office understood how badly the situation looked. But while Krauskopf went quiet and the organization faced intense criticism online, something very different was happening with the players. Their actions were starting to tell a much more revealing story about what was really happening inside the Fever. For 2 straight years, many people had misunderstood that story, and Lexi Hull was one of the first players to show what was actually going on. As one of Caitlin Clark's closest teammates, Exie Hull, one of Caitlin Clark's closest teammates, was one of the first players to speak openly about what she believed was happening around the league. In a profile with Glamour, Hull said there was real jealousy surrounding the Fever because of the massive attention, media coverage, and crowds that followed Clark's arrival. She made an even stronger claim, saying rival teams had openly talked in their locker rooms about stopping Indiana from winning. According to Hull, there were actual conversations and plans focused on how to beat the Fever, and she believed one player was the main reason Indiana had become such a major force. Sophie Cunningham later backed up the idea and took it even further. Cunningham, who quickly became known as one of Clark's toughest teammates and someone willing to stand up for her, said she had heard similar locker room talk before joining Indiana when she was still with Phoenix. According to Cunningham, those conversations weren't simply about basketball strategy. They were about physically sending a message to Clark. That changed the way many fans viewed the hard fouls, elbows, pushes, and other physical plays Clark had experienced, especially when they felt officials failed to call them. What once looked like separate incidents began to look like part of a larger pattern to some viewers. Then Clark's groin injury forced her to miss 11 games, and after appearing in only 13 games, her season came to an early end. As the frustration grew, more fans began asking a question that had been building for 2 seasons. Was Caitlin Clark being properly protected by WNBA officiating? The longer people watched the footage, the more they began reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. Many believed Caitlin Clark was not being properly protected. But there was another story developing at the same time. For more than a year, some fans had been told that Clark was creating problems inside the Fever locker room, while injuries continued to pile up and questions about the organization grew. In September 2024, Hall of Famer Cheryl Swoops made a serious claim on a podcast, suggesting that some important people around the Fever were struggling with the attention surrounding Clark, and that there were signs of tension behind the scenes. The clip quickly spread across the internet, but over time it became background noise. Clark eventually addressed the broader issue herself during a podcast appearance with Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi. Her response was calm and straightforward. She explained that people often assume they know what happens behind closed doors when they really have no idea, and her teammates' actions appeared to support her words. After returning from injury, Clark produced 32 points, 9 assists, and 8 rebounds in the 2025 playoffs, and her teammates immediately surrounded her on the court to celebrate. They stayed with her after games, showed up for her without being asked, and celebrated together after the Fever won the Commissioner's Cup. The hugs, laughter, and excitement looked genuine rather than something staged for cameras. According to this view, the real story was never that Clark's teammates disliked her, they clearly cared about her. The bigger question was whether the Fever front office was doing enough to give the team what it needed to succeed. And that brings the story back to Krauskopf's Apple comment. During that same October 2024 press conference, she also made another statement that received far less attention at the time, that any smart basketball player would want the opportunity to play alongside Caitlin Clark. Looking back, that prediction appears especially important because Indiana's recruiting story has become one of the most interesting parts of the entire situation. Some players have reportedly been willing to accept less money or choose Indiana over potentially bigger opportunities elsewhere because they wanted to play with Clark. Veterans have expressed excitement about joining her. playing in packed arenas, appearing on national television, and becoming part of something bigger than just another WNBA season. That desire to be part of something bigger is not a coincidence. Free agents usually don't accept less money just because a team has a strong branding plan. They make those choices because they believe in the situation, the players, and the opportunity in front of them. Without asking for it, Caitlin Clark had become one of the biggest factors influencing WNBA free agency. Her relationship with Aaliyah Boston developed into a genuine friendship and strong partnership both on and off the court. Lexi Hull, who was initially cautious around Clark, eventually became one of her closest teammates. Sophie Cunningham was openly excited about Clark even before they became teammates, while rookie Michaela Onyenwere showed clear respect for her from the beginning. Clark also supported her teammates when two of them were selected during the off-season expansion draft, posting heartfelt messages online for Christy Wallace and Chloe Bibby. These relationships were not simply professional connections created by the front office. They looked like real friendships, trust and chemistry. That is where the bigger issue comes in. The Fever's front office did not create the culture and excitement that attracted players to Indiana. It wasn't the result of a marketing strategy or some carefully designed brand campaign. Much of it came from one player who had become the central reason the franchise mattered so much. That brings us back to the main argument. While the organization talked about building a powerful brand and creating an Apple-like identity, the evidence told a different story. Ticket sales, TV ratings, merchandise, social media engagement, free agent interest, and overall cultural attention all pointed toward the same person, Caitlin Clark. When Clark was injured, the decline in attention, ratings, buzz, and resale ticket prices became impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever had become deeply connected in the public's mind. Every time the front office appeared to separate the franchise from the player who helped create its massive popularity, the numbers, players, and fans seemed to push back. Interview, and that leads directly into the 2026 crisis. The next season could become one of the most important periods in recent Fever history, and the biggest question may not even be what Clark does on the court. It could come down to how the front office handles the team around her. The 2026 expansion draft had already taken a major toll on the roster, with Portland selecting Chloe Bibby and Toronto taking Christy Wallace, two players Clark genuinely cared about. Losing them meant more than losing basketball talent. It also meant losing familiar voices, friendships, chemistry, and pieces of the locker room culture that had developed around Clark. Those kinds of losses may not show up immediately on a stat sheet, but their impact can become much clearer months later when every team loses players in an expansion draft, so that alone isn't a crisis. The real question is whether the Fever will truly build around Caitlin Clark or keep talking about brand growth while the foundation of their success slowly disappears. The uncomfortable truth is that if Clark ever decides she's had enough, everything could change. Attendance, TV ratings, media attention, free agent interest, and sponsorships could all take a major hit. The front office has to understand what's at stake and act accordingly. Clark needs the right teammates, a coaching staff that maximizes her strengths, and serious investment in her health through proper medical care, recovery, and workload management. Most importantly, the Fever must treat her like the generational talent she is, not simply as part of a marketing strategy. You build around a player like Clark and do everything possible to keep her, because there may never be another Caitlin Clark in women's basketball. Caitlin Clark is bigger than just one team, one city, or even the WNBA itself. The attention, excitement, and momentum surrounding women's basketball today have been heavily influenced by her presence. Over the next year, we'll see whether the Fever's leadership truly understands that or continues chasing a brand-focused vision while the biggest asset they already have is standing right in front of them. If you followed Clark's journey from Iowa to the WNBA, you know this story is about more than basketball. It's about influence, pressure, expectations, and how one player can completely change an entire sports landscape. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the Fever are building properly around Clark, or do you think the organization needs to make major changes? Share your thoughts, and if you enjoyed the discussion, subscribe for more stories covering Caitlin Clark, the WNBA, and the biggest developments in women's basketball.